trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.
On behalf of the City of Whittlesea, I recognise the rich Aboriginal heritage of this country and acknowledge the Wurundjeri Willem clan as the traditional owners of this place. I'd also like to personally acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Officers, I haven't got a conflict of interest in relation to any item on the agenda. Can we now move to confirmation of the minutes? And I note that there are 4 sets of minutes to confirm as follows. Firstly, the ordinary meeting of Council held on the 7th of April 2020, the adjourned ordinary meeting of Council held on the 15th of April 2020, the adjourned ordinary meeting of Council held on the 16th of April 2020, and finally the special meeting of Council held on the 16th of April 2020. And I note that I have reviewed the above 4 sets of minutes, and I'm satisfied that they're an accurate reflection of all of those meetings, and thereby I hereby resolve to confirm the minutes of the above meetings. Manager Governance, are there any questions from the public?
Yes, Administrator. There is one question from the public that relates to a significant strategic matter affecting the City as it concerns the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Council's long-term budget.
Thank you. Nick Brain of Epping has asked what strategy does the Council have in place to manage this impact to ensure its long-term capital works program is financially viable. So the response is that the COVID-19 pandemic is clearly an unprecedented event which continues to evolve, and Council clearly won't know the full impact of COVID-19 for some time. We have, however, produced a balanced draft budget for 2020-21, including committing $2 million for pandemic recovery to enable Council to continue to deliver its core services and ongoing investment in major projects that are critical to our growing community. Our operational budget and our COVID-19 recovery fund has not and will not affect our capital works program. Council plans to invest $83.86 million in our capital works program in 2020-21. And I'd strongly encourage our community to visit our website and view Council's draft 2020-21 budget and draft strategic resource plan, which are currently out on public exhibition. The draft budget outlines our capital works projects planned for next financial year, and submissions can be made up until Friday the 29th of May. I note we have not received any petitions and joint letters. And if we could now move to general business, I'll ask the responsible executive to provide a brief overview of their report prior to my consideration of the recommendation. And to the extent necessary, I'll therefore resolve to suspend standing orders to allow that to occur for each item in section 6 of the notice paper. So if we could move to item 6.1.1, Planning Scheme Amendment C245, request for authorisation for a heritage overlay on 90 and 100 Bints Road, Woolwich. And if I could ask the Director, Partnerships, Planning and Engagement to provide an overview of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator. This report before you seeks resolution from Council to request authorisation from the Minister for Planning to prepare and exhibit an amendment to the Whittlesea Planning Scheme that would see a heritage overlay applied to the properties at 90 Bints Road, and also to modify an existing heritage overlay at 100 Bints Road in Woolwich. So heritage is a high priority for the City of Whittlesea. And we have a statutory obligation to identify, protect places of state, regional and local historical significance, And this is often achieved in I guess, in the growth area context through incorporating those buildings and features as part of broader subdivisions. This particular matter has been prompted as a result of requests for demolition of the buildings, and upon that it was discovered that the heritage overlays did not encompass all of the heritage features. So through the planning permit process, officers sought expert heritage advice, and taking that advice into consideration, applied to the Minister for an interim controls. The Minister for Planning is reluctant to ever grant interim controls until such time as Council demonstrates that there is a real pursuit to apply the heritage overlays, hence why this report's before you today. We sort of went back and had a look at to understand why the sites were missed out previously, and both sites were essentially, we think, has come about as a result of them being coupled together under a couple of separate heritage studies. So one was a 1990 study, another was a 2009 study. Both identified the site and buildings as heritage of heritage importance. However, when it came time to apply the overlay, it was only applied to one of the properties. So, so from our understanding, it's a historical oversight, if you like, and we believe that the current process allows for it to now capture the sites and the importance. I guess one of the critical questions that you might be thinking about is why are we advancing this? And again, if we just go back to the sites, go back to the 1860s, 1880s, they are examples of the early German settlement in the region, and it is intended to capture the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the stone fences, a stone track, a water tank, and some associated river red gums. So they are all of importance, and that's been supported by the heritage experts. It's important to note that going through this process, the overlay doesn't prohibit development. It just ensures that there's further consideration around retaining and protecting the historical importance. So we think that a favourable resolution will enable the Minister to approve the interim controls formally, and also allow for the amendment process to proceed, which will enable the landowners the ability to make submissions and be heard before a panel if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. I do actually have a couple of questions in relation to this particular report of the Acting CEO. So my first question really is, could you perhaps outline the timelines for the interim controls, but also for the subsequent amendment to our planning scheme, including the consultation processes?
Thank you, Administrator, and I'll call upon the Director of Partnerships, Planning and Engagement to respond to those questions.
Thank you. So essentially the process would be upon support for the current report before Council, the Minister for Planning would then decide whether to authorise and exhibit the amendment to proceed, and that would normally be coupled with the approval for the interim controls. That sort of timing would typically come within a month or so back to Council. Exhibition would then go usually for a period of also a month, 28 days. That may be extended under the current circumstances at the moment. However, it is focused specifically with the landowners, as they are the ones who can be impacted the greatest. So that would go through that process. We would then see what sort of response we received from the landowner, and if they were submissions that couldn't be resolved, then we'd be seeking an independent panel to advance the amendment. So it's likely that would not be occurring until sometime towards the end of the year, and then subsequently the panel's recommendation would go back to the Minister and Council.
So just secondary to that response, does that mean that the consultation processes really relate to the full amendment process as opposed to the interim controls?
That's correct. Yes, yeah. The normal practice would be that the interim controls are put in place to provide that short-term protection whilst we go through a proper amendment process.
Thank you. And then I do have a further question, which is really whether you could clarify the intent behind the third recommendation in the report, whereby the acting CEO or their delegate be authorised to negotiate the ultimate heritage curtilage.
Sure thing. As part of the process, a curtilage, so a line around the historical features, would normally be proposed. That can sometimes shift depending on what the position of whether it's the minister, the minister's office, or the panel may come back with. So they may suggest dropping a feature out. For example, a stone wall might be included that they determine is not actually of significance. That would then adjust the boundary. So it is the final alignment of what is included in that historical importance and the heritage overlay. The request is simply more of a procedural nature, taking upon that advice and determining that exact location in the end. Again, normal practice would be to delegate that to the CEO to allow that to be finalised.
All right, thank you. So just in considering this report, I note that Council has got the adopted heritage conservation policy, which clearly aims to protect and maintain the integrity and character of Whittlesea's heritage, and I strongly support that policy and note that the identification of places of heritage significance, whether local or higher, has not been completed, but rather, as you've indicated, is an ongoing process. So having heard the overview that you've provided, Director, and I've obviously read the report and had a separate briefing in relation to this item, I agree with the recommendations in the agenda papers and they are adopted. Thank you. If we could move now to item 6.1.2, 6 Pleasant Road, Thomastown, planning permit application number 718660, construction of 4 dwellings. And again, if I could ask the Director of Partnerships, Planning and Engagement to provide an overview of this report.
Thank you, Administrator. So this one's an application for a planning permit to construct 4 double-storey dwellings on the site at 6 Pleasant Road in Thomastown. The site's within a residential area that is zoned for residential growth, and that's I guess the highest order of the residential zone categories, and that's because of its location and proximity to the Thomastown train station and shopping precinct, which is about a sort of 400-metre walk. So the application's been through a normal statutory process. It included advertising. There were 2 objections received, and there was also a petition with 10 signatures. The grounds of objection related to concerns associated with the lack of airflow running through the property and to neighbouring properties, overshadowing, overlooking additional traffic in the area, collection of waste, noise, and decreased property values. So I guess they're fairly common for the types of concerns that we receive for these types of applications. The officers have been through a detailed assessment and subject to conditions and taking into consideration all of those concerns, have formed a view or a recommendation that the proposal should be supported and so obviously subject to the inclusion of conditions. That's probably a reasonable summary for that.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Director. Again, I do have a question for the acting CEO. And it does actually relate to something that's already been mentioned by the Director, which is the fact that we had a number of objectors to this particular application, including one with 10 signatories. And I note from this report that there are a number of very specific conditions attached to the report. There's actually 21 conditions, some with multiple parts. And a number of those specific conditions address concerns that have been directly raised by objectors. And I was really wondering whether you could advise the process whereby Council will be monitoring compliance against the conditions in the report, whether they relate to sustainable design or landscaping, infrastructure or general amenity.
Thank you, Administrator. And again, I'll ask the Director of Partnerships, Planning and Engagement to respond to that question.
Thank you. So there's a number of stage gates, if you like, in terms of compliance with planning permits, and I guess the first is there's an added check following this process of so once the plans are endorsed, any building permit subsequently applied for, the building surveyor needs to ensure that the building permit and those plans are compliant with the planning permit plan. So they will initially check for that compliance as they monitor construction of the development. We then have further stage gates, if you like, where at the subdivision stage we'll often undertake an inspection of the site to check that it's been built in accordance with the endorsed plans, and that usually includes the landscaping and all the overlooking treatments and those kind of matters. Subsequent to that, where there is a planning permit that's been approved and with the associated endorsed plans, it has ongoing effect. So whilst those buildings are built, if at any stage anyone wants to make changes to those dwellings, they need to come back through council. And so that equally applies for residents. If residents are concerned that they notice something's changed, you know, it could be as simple as a trellis coming off the fence, they can report that through to us and we can go and inspect the site and ensure that it is brought back into compliance with the permit. So in summary, we have a number of measures to ensure that that all those conditions are complied with, essentially in perpetuity whilst the dwellings are there.
Thank you, Director.
Thanks.
So again, having been previously briefed on this particular planning application, and I note that it fully complies with the requirements of Clause 55 of the Whittlesea Planning Scheme, and the response that I've just had from the Director, particularly in relation to compliance with all of the conditions associated with this particular planning application, I approve planning application number 718660 and all of the specified conditions contained within the report. Thank you. If we move to item 6.1.3, statutory planning practices, IBAC Operation Sandon, City of Casey, and again, if I could ask the Director of Partnerships, Planning and Engagement to provide an overview of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator. So you might be familiar with Operation Sandon, which is an IBAC investigation currently underway into planning practices at the City of Casey. So a number of the parties, so whether individuals or companies that have been listed and named in that particular investigation at the City of Casey, I guess some of them have had interactions with the City of Whittlesea over the years, and whether that be previously or currently, and that be through projects. And I guess what the former council, prior to your arrival, and also Council's Audit and Risk Committee wanted to do was to take a due diligence approach and ensure that that we were looking into all of those matters to understand what sort of implications might have existed for our practices here at the City of Whittlesea. So the report is to bring, will provide an update essentially to Council and advise of the initial advice from the Audit and Risk Committee, as well as essentially bring yourself up to date as to what has been progressing in the background and the like. So the recommendation essentially is to place detailed investigations on hold pending the outcomes of the IBAC investigation, where we believe we'll get some further guidance. So this approach is not uncommon to a number of other councils who have been also undertaking similar investigations.
Thank you, Director. I note that I'm actually quite familiar with Operation Sandon and the City of Casey IBAC inquiry, and I have been briefed since taking on the role of Administrator at Whittlesea in relation to what has occurred to date here. And I have also reviewed the relevant documentation, including the report to the Audit and Risk Committee of the 5th of March of this year. And I strongly support the recommendations of this report, particularly the need to await the outcomes of the IBAC hearing in relation to Operation Sandon at the City of Casey and all of the associated recommendations that might come out of that inquiry. Thank you. Thank you. If we move to item 6.2.1, provision of delivered meals service, and I note that the report for this item was withdrawn from the 7th of April 2020 Council meeting agenda under clause 33 of the procedural matters. Therefore, the report will now be considered at today's meeting. However, I do actually have further questions on this matter and the confidential attachment, and therefore I resolve that this item be considered later in the meeting. Item 6.4.1, panel contract expenditure distribution, and if I could ask the Director of Corporate Services to provide an overview of this report.
Thank you, Administrator. This item is asking Council to note the report on panel contract expenditure distribution. Council undertakes a tender process to establish contracts for the provision of works, goods and services. Depending on the nature of that contract, the contract is either awarded to a single contractor or a panel of contractors. This report provides detail regarding the distribution of expenditure to contractors engaged under panel contracts. And provides Council oversight of such distribution to ensure fairness, transparency and best value. Thank you.
Thank you, Director of Corporate Services. I don't have any specific questions in relation to this report, but I do note that the process of reporting on panel contract expenditure has been in place at Whittlesea since 2012 to ensure, as you've indicated, compliance with approved procurement processes, best value for Council, and obviously ensure compliance with relevant regulatory and legislative provisions, including the Local Government Act 1989, and I strongly support that approach and resolve to note the report is recommended. Thank you. Item 6.4.2 is Council Action Plan 2019-20. This is the Quarter 3 Progress Report. And again, if I could ask the Director of Corporate Services to provide the overview of this report.
Thank you. This item is asking Council, obviously, to note the Council Action 1920 Quarter 3 Progress Report, including that COVID-19 has impacted on the delivery timelines of some action plan milestones, and note also that one major initiative in the Council Action Plan will not be achieved by 30 June 2020. The Council Action Plan 2019-20 has 28 major initiatives to be delivered in 1920. In Quarter 3 there were 36 milestones, of which 26 were achieved. 5 milestones were delayed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it's expected that all all initiatives other than the one mentioned are expected to be achieved by 30 June 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. I have one question of the Acting CEO, and that is that I note, as has been stated, that the majority of Council Action Plan commitments will be achieved by year end, which is really commendable, albeit that there will be some slight delays associated with our efforts and diversion of resources to provide community support in relation to COVID-19. The major initiative that was noted regarding building accessibility will be impacted in relation to its completion, and given the importance of that particular initiative, I wondered if you could advise what the anticipated completion date, particularly in relation to our building upgrades.
Thank you, Administrator. And as you rightly say, the major initiative that relates to Council undertaking building accessibility improvement works is in fact a rolling program that Council has adopted over several years, and of late the expenditure in this area has actually been on the increase. This year an independent audit was conducted just around advising Council and informing it on priorities on which this rolling program should operate, and therefore offering us a better structure in which to conduct works in sequence. As a result, we are not going to expend the full allocated amount this year, but are rolling that into the program as it continues, and we anticipate that within a period of 6 months we would have achieved a catch-up in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Acting CEO. So I note this report and the non-achievement of the one major initiative in the 2019-20 action plan, and I particularly note that that is really only an anticipated 6-month delay. And in so doing, can I particularly acknowledge the efforts of staff in minimising the impact of delayed delivery in relation to our action plan, while also obviously expending so much energy in implementing the multiplicity of unanticipated COVID-19 initiatives. So if you could pass on my recognition of that. Thank you. Thank you, Director. Item 6.5.1 is a review of council delegations to the Chief Executive Officer, and if I could actually ask the Manager Governance to provide an overview of this report.
Thank you, Administrator. This report is a standard review of Council's delegations to the CEO, and the two changes that are being recommended is an increase in the financial delegation to $1 million for goods and services, and to also allow for the approval of variations within 20% of the original approved contract sum.
Thank you, Manager. A couple of questions again to the Acting CEO. The first relates to the Local Government Act coming into force, and also that there will be the panel of administrators due to be appointed over the forthcoming months. And it's a question as to whether all of Council's delegations could be considered by Council in the short term.
Thank you, Administrator. Yes, Administrator, I do propose that for this to be considered as a whole of delegation document, and with a view to it coming to the August 2020 Council meeting.
Thank you, Acting CEO. And then the second question I have relates to the recommendation where there's a new provision for the CEO to be able to approve contract variations within 20% of the originally approved contract sum. And I just wonder whether you could clarify the intent behind that particular provision.
Yes, thank you, Administrator. The new provision, as you've quoted there, enables the bringing into line of the CEO delegation with that of the legal and statutory powers and duties that are conferred on to contract superintendents, and that power is made under the Security of Payments Act of 2002. So in essence, this provision will negate the requirement for administrative processing of retrospective approvals on these contracts and in this nature by Council.
Thank you, Acting CEO. Just on the basis of the briefing I already had on this particular matter, and I note within the report the benchmarking data that's been undertaken against other comparable councils, and your responses in relation to the full review of council delegations, but I strongly support these recommendations and amendments to the instrument of delegation to the Chief Executive Officer. I note that I've not listed any notices of motion for tonight's meeting, and also that there are no items of urgent business. So if we could move to reports from delegates. And I'd like to particularly note that last month I attended meetings of the Municipal Association of Victoria, the Yara Plenty Regional Library, and also Whittlesea Community Connections. And if I could just make a few comments in relation to each of those meetings. So in relation to the Municipal Association of Victoria, which is one of our peak bodies, I attended the MAV virtual mayoral forum on the 2nd of April 2020, And clearly the major focus of that particular forum was providing updates on key impacts right across Victorian local governments in relation to COVID-19, including financial impacts and also impacts associated with the preparation of budgets and council plans, and also in relation to rates, fees and charges, and also in respect of council election timelines and processes. And the President of the MAV, Coral Ross, also provided an update in relation to her discussions with the Minister for Local Government. So it was a very beneficial forum. Secondly, in relation to the Yara Plenty Regional Library, I participated on the 8th of April 2020 in an extraordinary Yara Plenty Regional Library online board briefing, and clearly the major focus again in relation to that briefing was associated with closure of our libraries, the impact on our service users, importantly the significant increase in utilisation of our online services, planning for the recovery phase ahead of us, and also providing an update on infrastructure upgrades across the regional library. So a very important library board meeting. And then on the 23rd of April, again, I had an audit committee of the board, which was also a virtual meeting, and also the ordinary board online meeting on that same day. And a key focus of that particular meeting was in relation to the preparation of the draft budget going forward and further updates in relation to our initiatives associated with COVID-19 and, as I mentioned earlier, in relation to future recovery phase. And then in relation to Whittlesea Community Connections, on the 16th of April, I participated in a comprehensive induction for Whittlesea Community Connections, and importantly, I was briefed obviously on the Constitution, Code of Conduct, an overview of the multiplicity of services that very important organisation provides across the municipality, the pressure on their services associated with COVID-19, and the acknowledgement of the excellent working relationship over many years that Whittlesea Community Connections has with council at all levels. And then I had a further meeting on the 20th of April of the Whittlesea Community Connections Board, and again there were very comprehensive updates provided at that board meeting in relation to COVID-19 initiatives and acknowledgement of the very significant additional funding that council had provided of $50,000 towards support to our local communities and emergency relief. So some very valuable meetings that I have had the privilege of attending over the last few weeks. Officers, I now resolve to close the meeting to the public under Section 89 of the Local Government Act 1989 for consideration of confidential items. We'll ask all officers to leave and only the acting CEO and manager governance to remain. Thank you. Officers, I now open the meeting to the public, and I would like to return to item 6.2.1, provision of delivered meals service. And I will just note that I have obviously had the responses to my questions in relation to the council report and in relation to the confidential item, and I resolve as recommended. Thank you. There being no further business, I declare this meeting closed.